Hello and welcome to this PIR live event brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. My name is Stacey Joyce. I'll be your host. Just a reminder to ask questions during this webinar. You can find the chat function in the top left-hand side of your screen, and make sure you select everyone in the to field so that all of our students can see the questions coming in from across the country. Don't forget to include your name, your school name, your teacher name, or your city so we can give you a shout out when we ask your question. Today's guest is Dr. Andrea Kirkwood. She is an Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll let you take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me into your classrooms across Canada. I was kind of excited to hear that there's a class from Calgary because I lived in Calgary for almost 4 years, not too long ago, just less than 10 years ago. So welcome, and hopefully you're all kind of keen to learn about aquatic ecology, because that's basically what I study. I'm an aquatic ecologist. And I'm going to go through a few slides of pictures showing you the type of research that we do in my lab. So in the Kirkwood Lab, the type of research that we do is studying the health of lakes. So here's a picture of Lake Ontario, which we study. And we're interested in studying the health of lakes because we depend on lakes for our drinking water and for swimming and enjoying recreational activities. And of course, lakes are really important habitat for animals and plants and aquatic food webs. So I'll get into that shortly. Another aspect of the research that we do in my lab is that, you know, most people don't live in the country, they don't live in the woods, they don't live in the wilderness. They actually live in cities and towns, and this is known as urban centers. Okay, so all of you, I believe, are living in probably a town or a city, and the types of activities that happen, at least human activities that happen in these systems, are that we like to pave everything. We like to build buildings with hard roofs and pave over you know, what used to maybe be farmers' fields and forests to build shopping malls and roads. And so there's actually a big impact to aquatic ecosystems. So we do a lot of research looking at those impacts. And then finally, I thought I'd just throw in what we call in the research lingo applied research. So applied means, well, what's something that we can research that we can actually it can be used in society? Well, the organisms that we tend to study in my lab are known as algae. And because we know that fossil fuels are responsible, at least our use of fossil fuels are responsible for climate change, we're looking at alternative sources of fuel. And so algae, that you can see growing in these tubes here, all they need is light and water and some nutrients, and they can actually produce alternatives to fossil fuels for our energy needs. Okay, so starting with lake ecosystems. So for most of you that live in Ontario, you've maybe probably gone up north to a cottage and perhaps a cottage on a lake. And those of us who live in Ontario really cherish our lakes because they, for the most part, are pretty clean. We can swim in them, and then they're our source of drinking water. And so in these types of areas, there's lots of trees and, you know, maybe some developments, some, you know, cottages and houses that are around the shoreline. But generally speaking, when you have a watershed, which this is, we call it a watershed because water, when it rains, it drains from the watershed into lake systems, means that when you have lots of trees and natural vegetation, they filter out the dirt and pollution, and our water is pretty clean. But when you have lakes that are surrounded, and perhaps those of you from Calgary may think this looks a little bit more familiar, it's what they call a slough out west. When you have all of this intensive agricultural activity, there's lots of fertilizer and maybe some manure gets washed into the lake. And what that does is it makes the algae and plants really happy because they've got lots of food. But unfortunately, what they end up doing is they fill in the lake and they cause algal blooms, and then they cause oxygen to decline, and that causes fish to die off. So that's not a great situation. So because of this, because we know that humans can have a big impact on the health of ecosystems, my lab is interested in looking at cottage country lakes, and if we build more cottages and maybe if we build more towns and cities around lakes, is that going to impact our lakes? And so for those of you from Ontario are looking at this map and you're like, what is that with all those colors? Well, I'll help you out here, because what it is it's a map that probably would be really fun to use crayons and color in, following the numbers here. But this is Lake Ontario, and I'm situated in Oshawa here, and those from Toronto are here, and those from Hamilton, you're off the map here. But this is Georgian Bay. And if you just focus on the color scheme, what the colors represent are the types of rocks. So underneath soil are what we call bedrock. And so the bedrock can be different. So those of us who live in Southern Ontario, it's mostly limestone. So that's why if you like to collect fossils, limestone is a pretty, sedimentary rock. It's a pretty good place to hunt for fossils from, millions of years ago. But as you go north, you'll see this line. And this is known as the land between, because the land between this limestone-dominated landscape to a more granite-dominated landscape. Look at all the colors. What this means is that places like Bancroft and Halliburton and the Kawarthas are situated on a really diverse, varied geological landscape. So why is this important? Well, the type of rocks that are in the landscape will affect the kinds of nutrients that are in water, in lake water, and also the pH. So pH is probably a term that you guys aren't really that familiar with. But if you think of vinegar, so vinegar is what we call acidic. So it has a low pH. And then there's higher pH when you think of, baking soda, or, maybe bleach, for example. These are really extreme examples of high pH and low pH. And so neutral pH is generally what lakes in our areas, they're slightly acidic, but they're generally neutral. So it means that there's a pH balance. And you've probably heard of commercials talking about pH balance for underarm deodorant. Well, pH balance is actually a good thing because it helps to stabilize ecosystems. So I went into that spiel because rocks can actually play a big role in dictating the type of pH of a lake. And so on this side, there's not as many lakes, and I'll explain a reason why shortly, but lakes that are situated here tend to be more alkaline. So they have a higher pH. Lakes on this side tend to have a lower pH because, or what they call soft water lakes, because they don't have enough ions to bring the pH up. But they're generally, healthy lakes are generally pH neutral. Now we have lots of lakes up here compared to down here. And the reason for that is related to the last ice age. So pretty much all of Canada was underneath, not all, but most of Canada was underneath a huge ice sheet that was over 1 kilometer thick in places. So what ended up happening is as that glacier retreated, it dumped a lot of dirt here, but it didn't have much dirt left over when it retreated from here. So originally it scraped off all the soil from this part and just left barren rock. And so it's going to take many thousands of years for the soil to build up. And this is why when you go up to cottage country, they call it the Canadian Shield, because it's just an exposed shield of granite bedrock. Okay, so I went into that in detail because it's important for understanding lake ecosystem health, because that's kind of what we're starting at with respect to the natural conditions. What are controlling the natural lake conditions? And a lot of it has to do with the landscape, the rocks and the trees and so forth. So I had students, they go out and they measure the water clarity. So this is known as a Secchi disc here. Maybe some of you have seen something like that. Maybe your community participates in a Secchi dip-in. So basically a Secchi dip-in is when volunteers go out to their local lake and they put this disc into the water and it goes down. And as soon as it disappears from view, you mark on this rope here, you mark the distance. And that distance represents how far light can penetrate into the lake water. And how far light can penetrate into lake water is important because light is used by algae, phytoplankton, and phytoplankton photosynthesize and grow, and then they're food for bugs, and then the bugs are food for fish. So really important to know how light energy gets into lakes. Sometimes my students have to wear rain gear because they have to sample, and they have to collect water samples, whether it's rainy or sunny. And then we take measurements. So this is known as a probe, and it goes down into the lake at different depths, and it measures the amount of oxygen and the temperature, as well as pH that I just talked about. And so what we do is we collect these samples out in the lake, and then we come back to the lab and we analyze our samples. So we're looking at the chemistry, what's the pH, what's the amount of ions. These are things you'll probably learn about once you get into high school chemistry, and how much nutrients are in the water, and also the algae that are in the water. So this is a very famous picture. This picture is probably taken about 40 years ago now, from an airplane, but it's actually a picture of a lake in northwestern Ontario in an area called the Experimental Lakes area. And in Canada, we're really fortunate. We have, over 1 million lakes. And so we have a few lakes that we can use for what we call whole lake experiments. And in those experiments, we can what we call manipulate. So we can add nutrients, we can take fish out, we can put fish in, we can do different things to see, basically experiment what would happen if we did this. So with nutrients, back in the 1960s, so way back in time, going back 50 years ago, our Great Lakes were becoming heavily polluted with nutrients, and there are massive algae blooms. And so they had to figure out, well, what is the nutrient that is causing these algae blooms? And so when they added nutrients to this lake, they added certain nutrients to this side, and they added certain nutrients to this side. And because you can see this green color, that's an algae bloom, they were able to determine that it's phosphorus. Phosphorus is an element, and it's found in rocks, but it's also found in detergents and fertilizers that we put on, to grow our vegetables. And it's also in manure, so cow poop. So all of that stuff ends up in lakes. And when you have too much phosphorus, you get lots of algae growing. So that's one thing, looking at how much algae can grow, and that's what we studied in our lakes. But we also look at the algae themselves. So these are pictures, pictures using the microscope, so they're microscopic pictures of what some algae look like. You've got some long, kind of rod-like cells. You've got ones with spines on them, and you have colonies, and basically all different kinds of algae. And why this is of interest to us is that different algae like different conditions. So if we want to understand lake ecosystem health, we can make conclusions about, well, what kinds of algae are there? So if you have what we call a diverse ecosystem with lots of different kinds of algae, that's a generally healthy system, because it means that different kinds of algae can coexist together. There's not a lot of pollution, so there's nothing that's going to harm the sensitive algae. However, when you change the nutrients in a lake, you can change the type of algae that live there. So this picture here is a picture, a microscope image of a certain algae known as blue-green algae. And you'll see these really bright, large circles. Well, these large circles are special cells called heterocysts. Heterocysts have a very important job for this algae. They actually help this algae dominate, cause a lake to look like this when a certain nutrient is not in high supply, and that's nitrogen. So most algae, like these guys over here, they need nitrogen to be in the form of nitrate, nitrite, and ammonia. But these algae, they're like, we could actually make our own nitrogen, because I'm not sure if you guys know this, but do you know what the most common element is in the air that you breathe? It's not oxygen, it's not carbon dioxide, it's nitrogen gas. 80% of the air that we breathe, our atmosphere, is nitrogen. But it's in a form that's not really available for us to use, for most of us anyway. So these heterocysts help this algae turn what we call gaseous nitrogen, so nitrogen from the atmosphere, into nitrite and nitrate, forms of nitrogen that are actually useful for the algae to grow. And so that's what gives it a competitive advantage. So when we're trying to make, when we're trying to understand the lakes that we're studying, we see lots of these guys. We can say, without even taking any nutrient measurements, oh, we know this lake doesn't have a lot of nitrogen because this algae is doing really well. It can make its own. Now this algae down here, it's another blue-green algae. And it gets its name. They're actually bacteria, these two here, but we still call them algae because they're very similar in what how they grow to these algae. The microcystis, it's a colony former. So this is a colony of many, many cells, as you can see. There's a little cell there. And what can happen is it can cause a lake to look like this when there's too much phosphorus. But the additional thing that's of concern is this algae actually produces toxins. So toxins are chemicals that, if ingested, can make you really sick. So the toxins that microcystis produce can harm our livers. And there's other toxins that can be produced that can harm our brains. So another reason why we don't want a lake to look like this, because we don't want it to produce toxic algae. So I don't know if any of you have kind of into, reading newspapers or watch the news, but a couple of years ago, the city of Toledo had to stop its drinking water plant from taking in any lake water because Lake Erie had a big bloom of this. So an algae bloom looks like this green color. This is regular lake water, and this is the green algae bloom. Well, if microcystis was blooming in Lake Erie, and Toledo depends on Lake Erie for the drinking water, they couldn't drink the water because the toxins were being produced by this microcystis. So something to keep in mind of why we have to be interested in lakes and healthy, in keeping our lakes healthy, because they help keep us healthy. So another part of the type of research we do in my lab is trying to understand urban aquatic systems and how stormwater affects them. So for many of you, I'm not sure if you know much about climate change, but we're experiencing climate change right now. And one of the things about climate change is not just about our summers or just our climate in general getting warmer over time, but the prediction is, and what we're experiencing is that we're going to have stronger storms. So more thunderstorms in the summer. So these stronger storms are going to mean really heavy rain is going to hit this pavement here, and it's just going to rush right into our creek. So here's a creek down here that we want to protect, because this is actually in Calgary. For those of you from Calgary, this is from the very far south. This is Fish Creek, and it's in Fish Creek Provincial Park. And what they've done is they've built these stormwater ponds to help trap the water that rushes off this landscape. It's picking up fertilizer, it's picking up dirt, and then it lands here where it settles, and so some of that dirt and those pollutants can get trapped, and then eventually it trickles down to the creek. So this is actually kind of an ideal system where you're trying to protect the creek by trapping the first water that kind of runs off. Okay, so these stormwater ponds is what we look at because we're really interested in the pesticides, the metal pollutants that come off cars and other materials, and also what we call organic contaminants, like greases and oils that are from the fossil fuels that we burn. So they all end up in these stormwater ponds. So we want to understand, well, what happens to them when they enter these systems? So this is what a stormwater pond actually looks like if you think about it from a cartoon perspective, where you have inflow of the storm water rushes in, and so after a storm the water level goes up to here. But under normal water conditions, you have all the pollutants are basically settled down into the sediments, and then the water up here, especially if it comes up to this level, flows out to the stream. So this is the stream down here, Fish Creek. So my students have gone out to many stormwater ponds out where we are. We're out in Durham region, just east of Toronto. And we collect water, we take measurements, just like we do in the lakes, but in these stormwater ponds. And I also have graduate students that go into, actually these were undergraduate students, that test water in the creeks that receive water from the stormwater ponds, because we want to see how healthy they are. And this is a picture of a creek after a heavy storm. And so you can see what happens when it rains. When you get a heavy rain, all the dirt from the landscape gets forced off of the roads and parks and so forth, and it rushes into the creek. Now you've got this really dirty creek, and ecologists call this turbid. These waters are turbid, so very little light can penetrate. This has impacts to the fish and to the algae that live in these systems. So here's a nice picture of a stormwater drain. You can see this is during what we call base flow, so there, it hasn't rained in a while, so it's just trickling out. But look at all the algae that's growing here. So this, if you think of algae as being bioindicators, well, this is indicating that there must be lots of nutrients coming from this storm drain, because that's why we see lots of algae, because they just love nutrients and they eat it all up, and that's why there's so much of it. So to understand how the algae are living in these systems too, we put clay tiles into the creek water here, and then we pick them up about 3 weeks later and look at all the algae that grows on them. Then we take this back to the lab and we look at the algae to see what kinds of algae are there and how much of it, to give us an indication of, well, what's impacting this ecosystem. So finally, I'm just going to mention algae biofuels research that we do, because for those of you who watch SpongeBob, well, plankton, if you know much about SpongeBob, the creator of SpongeBob actually was a marine biologist. And so even though SpongeBob looks like a funny, sponge that you would use to clean your sink in your bathtub, plankton was actually created as what they call a composite of the different types of plankton you find in the ocean. And so plankton here, he has this eye, but that's actually real. There's algae that live in the ocean that have what we call an eye spot. So plankton actually looks pretty pretty close to what phytoplankton looks like out in the ocean. So what can we do with algae? When we grow lots of algae, because we know that algae loves nutrients, well, in my lab, we actually collect wastewater. So municipal wastewater has lots of nutrients. We grow algae in it, and then we look at the algae. So here's the nutrients, and there's the algae growing in these bioreactors. We extract oil from them, and this oil can then get used as fuel, known as biodiesel. So we're just really at the early stages of looking at what kinds of algae make the best oil and type of oil that would be good for using in, say, for jet fuel, for maybe even running our cars one day. So I'll end it there. I think it's important to acknowledge all of the wonderful students that have worked in my lab over the years, and I don't even think I could have fit all the pictures on my slide here, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. I hope I've left enough time for that. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of those images and your expertise with us. I have been furiously getting a hold of all these questions that have been coming in. So I'm going to jump right in to the first question from Ms. Roser's class in Calgary, Alberta. They want to know, what can a community and students at school do to help ponds and wetlands?
Oh, that's such a great question. And there is actually quite a bit you can do. Just as one example, one of many things you can do, but I participated in Earth Day cleanup a couple of years ago along a creek. And you know what the number one thing that we found, like, that was just garbage, was plastic. Even like cigarette wrapper plastic, plastic bottles. All of these plastics actually are a big problem. I'm not sure if you've covered this in any of your classes, but plastics getting into waterways are really causing some bad effects to our aquatic food web. So even if you could just organize a local Earth Day cleanup of your local creeks and lakes and ponds, you'd be amazed at all of the plastic that gets trapped in these, in the vegetation and so forth. And it doesn't even have to be big plastic. It could just be little tiny little bits of plastic, but all together it's actually quite a bit.
Great. Next question is from Mr. Legate's class in Markdale, Ontario. What happens to the lakes as the pollution starts to enter them? We talked a little bit about a couple types. Maybe you could elaborate.
Okay, so let's use the example of when nutrients, so when there's too much nutrients that get into a lake, what can happen is that the algae that grow in the lake love it, they grow too much, and they're too excessive, so they kind of choke out other organisms. But if you know anything about photosynthesis, you can think, well, algae produce oxygen, so isn't that good for the fish? And that's true. Fish need oxygen just like we do to breathe and to help us on our daily activities. The problem is when all that algae grows, it ends up dying. Just like plants, they die off in fall. Well, algae die off too, and when the algae die off, they sink to the bottom of the pond or lake. And then the bacteria eat up the algae because they love to eat dead things, because bacteria are really important for decomposing materials and cycling nutrients. But unfortunately, bacteria like oxygen too. And so bacteria will suck up all the oxygen in a lake, making it be very low in oxygen, and that actually causes fish to be killed. So they're known as fish kills, and they typically happen in winter time when the decomposition is happening under the ice. And so that's one of the major problems. We also have had a big problem, they call it the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, because of too much nutrients going into the Mississippi River, and it ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, and the algae eat up all the nutrients, they die off, and they create these areas that are really low oxygen that no animals can survive.
Well, I think you managed to answer a second question in there. We had someone asking about the health in the Caribbean. So that brings me to another question, though, about algae from Mr. McCleary's class in Burford, Ontario. They would like to know, is algae good for some of our natural fish, or are they always bad?
That's a really good question, because there's so much focus gets placed on, algal blooms, for example, but in fact, all aquatic ecosystems need algae. If algae didn't exist, we wouldn't have the bugs in the lake, the zooplankton, and we wouldn't have fish. It's part of the food web. So really, algae bring in energy into a system. So they convert sunlight into what we call fixed carbon, like organic carbon. Bringing that energy into the lake means that there's food for all of the other organisms in the lake. So they're really essential, very, very essential. And I would even argue too that algae and bacteria are really important for keeping a lake clean, because they help to break down some pollutants as well.
Great. Moderation, it always seems to be the key.
Totally.
So moving on a little bit to a different area, Ms. Villidson's class in Braeside School in Calgary would like to know a bit more about how you perform your research. So how do you make sure that the water is safe to drink, and what are the tools and methods you use to test lakes and rivers?
Okay, so in my lab, we measure nutrients. So we use a piece of equipment called a spectrophotometer, and when we use chemicals to extract the nutrients out of the water, and then we measure those nutrients in a spectrophotometer, for example, that gives us an indication of how much nutrients are in the water. We use microscopes to look at algae in the water, and we also can grow algae in the lab using light and water and incubators.
Okay, great. Moving on to Lake Ontario in particular, Alex from Kathy Weaver School would like to know if what he's heard about Lake Ontario water being unable to be cleared of pollution, is it true?
Ooh, that's a really good question too. Some great questions here. Lake Ontario is actually a really interesting system, because we've got, and not many people other than scientists are aware of this, but in Lake Ontario, there is what we call the near shore zone, which is near the shoreline, going out maybe, half a kilometer, to the offshore zone, which is, we think about the deep water area of the lake, in the middle of the lake. And what's happening in Lake Ontario is that the nearshore zone, because of zebra mussels, it has changed the whole ecosystem, so that you have nutrients get trapped in the nearshore zone, and they aren't able to get out to the offshore zone. So the offshore zone has the big fish that fishermen love to catch, like trout and salmon and so forth. But what's happening is that the algae don't have enough nutrients out there. And so there's not enough algae growing, so there's not enough food for the zooplankton, which means there's not enough food for those fish that fishermen like to catch. So that's a problem. And then you have in the nearshore zone, all these nutrients and contaminants, getting to your question, are being trapped. And so my lab is actually, we're proposing to do some research there to see how the algae and the bacteria and the zebra mussels are treating pollutants, as well as where these pollutants end up in the nearshore zone. So I would say with Lake Ontario, it's a very complicated ecosystem and it requires a lot more research. But I think we have seen in other systems that if you control pollution, you absolutely can clean up a lake.
Excellent. So there is still very much some hope there for cleaning
Yes.
things up. It's not all doom and gloom.
Yes.
So in that topic area, what initiatives are currently in place to revive or preserve our aquatic ecosystems? That question comes from Ms. Bradley's grade 9 science class at St. Ignatius of Loyola Catholic Secondary School.
Well, it is really important. Like, as a scientist, we can provide all of the evidence about what's happening in our lakes, but nothing will get done unless people, citizens, and the government get involved and develop what we call laws and policies to help protect our lakes. So for many years, we had, the Environmental Protection Act, the Fisheries Act. All of these important laws help protect our lakes. Now, these particular acts were changed over time with a different government, but our new government now is going to try and fix them again, so that when we have stronger regulations, they're going to be able to help protect our lakes better.
Excellent. So we're already over time, but there's so many questions. I want to squeeze in a couple more so our viewers can stay with us. We actually have a question from one of our teachers. You're never too old to learn. Mr. Ritter in Hamilton, Ontario would like to know why an ecosystem needs to be stable.
Interesting. Well, stability means then you can predict how it's going to be in the future. So if we depend on ecosystems for our drinking water, even in other ecosystems for our food supplies, pollinator systems, and so forth. If they aren't stable, then it's very difficult for us to be able to forecast and make predictions of how we're going to get our sustenance in the future as well. So that's one aspect. There's other aspects, but hopefully that's one that makes sense.
Great. Well, we've talked already about what some of the issues are, what some of the ways you can detect those issues are, what's currently being done to mitigate these issues, and also just some of the knowledge that you've learned in this area. But what about if students want to maybe pursue not only change in what they can do in their own communities, but what if they want to pursue research? What would you suggest that they do?
Oh, that'd be great. I'd love for all of you to be interested in continuing your studies and learning more about science and the environment. So basically, I think, first of all, everyone has the potential to be a scientist. It doesn't mean that you grow up to be a scientist necessarily, but I think if all of you who are citizens of the world, if you become familiar with science and the scientific method and why it's important to have evidence in forming your policies for protecting the environment, then that to me is very important. So basically it's just staying curious, doing your research and educating yourself using all of the tools that you have available to you. And then, of course, if you want to continue on, there's lots of opportunities in colleges and universities to do so.
Excellent. Well, that is certainly all the time we have. We've gone over by a few minutes already. Thank you so much, Dr. Kirkwood, for joining us and answering our questions today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And next week on PIR Live Event, we are talking about renewable energy. If you want information on this or more upcoming webinars, check out pirweb.org. Thanks for joining and have a great day.